Good Erev Shabbos, everybody. In Parshas Chukas, we have the very difficult incident of the sin of Moshe and Aharon, in which God tells them when Klal Yisrael comes to an area and they have no water because Miriam has died. And when Miriam died, the well of Miriam dried up and there was nothing for them to drink. They had no water to wash their infants. They had no water to quench their thirst, no water to do any cooking. And they complained to Moshe Rabbeinu, what should we do? Hashem says to Moshe, Kaches hamata, take the staff and gather the entire congregation, you and Aaron, your brother, speak to the rock before their eyes. It will give water. And you shall bring forth water from this rock, and it shall suffice to quench the thirst of all the congregation and their flock. And it states that Moshe took the staff from before God as he was commanded. Moshe and Aaron gathered the entire congregation of Israel before the stone, the rock. He said, listen, rebellious ones. Is it possible to bring forth water from this stone, this rock? And Moshe lifted his hand and he struck the rock with his staff. He struck it twice. Much water came forth, and the entire congregation and their cattle were able to drink. Hashem says to Moshe and Aaron, because you did not plant the seeds of great faith in me, within Klal Yisrael, and you did not sanctify me before the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore, you shall not bring this congregation to the land that I have given them. There are many, many explanations as to what exactly did Moshe do. Rashi says he was told to speak to the rock, but he struck it. Now, this was not the first time that we had the water coming from the rock. 40 years earlier, when God presented this miracle, Moshe was told to take the staff and strike the rock, which he did. So he did it now. What was the sin? Rashi says he was told, speak to the rock, not to strike it. Ramban asks, so then why did God tell him to take his staff? What was the purpose of taking the staff if not to use it to strike the rock? And also the Ramban says that Moshe is criticized. He did not sanctify God's name. It would have been a greater sanctification for Israel to see that Moshe was speaking to the rock, an inanimate object, and water comes forth. Ramban says, and if he strikes the rock, is it that much less of a miracle and a sanctification of God's name, an inanimate object? You hit it once, you hit it twice, and water comes forth. That's not an incredible, astounding miracle? Of course it is. That's also a Kiddush Hashem. How do we understand Rashi? The Kli Yakar presents a path to comprehend Rashi. Kli Yakar notices that God doesn't say to Moshe, Kaches matcha, take your staff, but rather he says, Kaches hamata, take the staff. And indeed, Moshe does. It says he takes the staff, milifnei Hashem, from before God. What does that mean? The staff was before God? Where was the staff that it's before God? And then when it states that Moshe struck the rock, it says bimatehu, with his staff. Doesn't say he struck the rock with the staff, but with his staff. Why does it mention this? So the Kli Yakar says, Klal Yisrael was saying, Moshe Rabbeinu, we have no water. We're going to die of thirst, a horrible death. God did not criticize them for this. But nevertheless, Hashem wanted them to see and learn a tremendous lesson. And therefore he said to Moshe, take the staff. Which staff is that? The staff that is before God. What staff is before God? Last week's Parsha Kairach. There were those who complained and they wanted to know why Aaron was chosen to be the Kohen Gadol. And finally Hashem said, I want a staff. Take one large, giant piece of wood, cut it into 12 sections. Let every leader of each tribe write his name on their section, and take all the staffs, Moshe, and the tribe of Levi will have the name of Aharon. Bring the staffs before God in the tabernacle, in front of the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. Place them there, and then bring them out the next day. Moshe did this. All the staffs remained the same dry, lifeless piece of wood that they were when they entered, with the exception of the staff of Aharon. This dry, lifeless piece of dead wood, it began to blossom and it began to bear fruit. And Hashem said to Moshe, take this staff and put it back before the covenant. It'll be an eternal reminder of God's choosing Aharon. Now Hashem is saying to Moshe, take the staff, this miraculous staff that is found before God in the Holy of Holies, before the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of Testimony, containing the 10 Commandments. Take it out and show it to all of Klal Yisrael. That was the purpose of Hashem saying, take the staff, not to use the staff to strike the rock. Show Klal Yisrael that you're standing and saying, we haven't got what to drink. We're dry, we're lifeless, we have no moisture. How can we exist? Show them that a dry, lifeless, worthless piece of wood will blossom and bear fruit if only the will of Hashem so desires. Show that to them. Indeed, Moshe did. But then Moshe took his own staff, and with that staff, he struck the rock, and water came out. And Hashem says to Moshe, you did not sanctify me to bring about and inspire a greater level of faith and belief. Why? Is this not a remarkable miracle? Yoker explains in one of his explanations, the generation that came out of Egypt, this was a generation that was accustomed to suffering, oppression, denial, persecution. This was a generation that was immersed in idolatry, in depraved behavior and corruption, improprieties, contamination of the soul. This generation needed to witness the miracles of Egypt, the plagues, the splitting of the sea, so that it could uproot all of this impurity. It could purge them from the contamination of thought and mind and soul. This generation needed to see the miracle of God bringing forth water from a stone, a flintstone, a chalomish, as dry as could be. They needed to see this miracle done with force, striking the rock. That's what this generation needed. For this generation had a very shaky foundation. And this generation needed to see power and force. But that was 40 years earlier. Now we're dealing with a different generation, the generation that is prepared to enter the land of Israel. This is a generation that has been raised, eating the mun, sheltered by the clouds of glory, drinking water that came from this stone, this rock, living in miracles, spending their days studying Torah from Moshe, learning human sanctity and excellence from Aaron and Miriam. This was a different generation. This was a generation whose foundation was rooted in purity and sanctity. And Hashem says, this generation you deal with differently. With this generation, you don't demonstrate force, striking the rock. This generation, we use words. We communicate verbally, orally. Let them see that it's not through force and might and awe and fear that we bond to our Creator, but rather we do so with love. This generation was capable of not just awe of God, but awe and love of God. And love doesn't result from force. Love results from communication, speaking, talking, listening, being sincerely interested. Let them hear the words as you speak to the stone, the lifeless stone, and they see the staff of Aharon, the lifeless piece of wood. As we listen to the words that our Creator instructs us, it will inspire us, bringing us to a higher level of faith and love, and thereby sanctify Hashem's name. The Torah is revealing that there are different generations. Some generations, they need to be dealt with harshly, strictly, with a discipline. Other generations, we have to deal more sensitively. We have to deal caressingly. We have to be so careful in how we express ourselves. And not only generations, but even with children within the same family. One child we can speak to and explain and tell them, and this is what's expected, and they'll do it. Another child, they don't respond to expectations and responsibilities. We have to be so careful and loving and so sure to make them feel safe and make them feel loved. And the truth is, even with the same child, sometimes we have to deal with a strong hand, a firm discipline, and then some days, maybe even the same day, we have to speak softly and warmly in a cuddling manner. And this is true not only in regard to our children, it's true in regard to ourselves. Sometimes we need to be realistic and say, these are the facts. This is what I deal with. This is the reality. And this is what my responsibility is. And I must do it. This is my discipline. And yet, sometimes we might not respond to that. Sometimes we might feel that I need something a little softer, a little more pleasant, a little more ingratiating. The Torah is showing us that we don't always have one path in which we are dealing with the human condition. In addition, the Torah is showing us that no matter what our circumstances, even if we feel that our bones are brittle and drying, nevertheless, if Hashem wants us to blossom and grow, even a desert can sprout. Is it not true what we've seen in the land of Israel? In the 20th century, there were those, Mark Twain went to the land of Israel and he said, no one can live there. The land, it's impossible. Nothing grows. And yet, Jews came, irrigating, and now we've got the most magnificent garden state that we have ever seen, with incredible produce that is coming forth. Whatever circumstances in our lives, whatever challenges, sometimes we need to say, there's a strong hand and I must respond. And sometimes we must say, there's an outstretched arm waiting to embrace me, and I will respond. Sometimes we respond to awe, and sometimes it's to love. But no matter what the challenge, we should never forget the staff of Aharon, the staff that is before God, that no matter what our circumstances, the Almighty will allow us to thrive, to blossom, and to grow in the midst of the greatest desert. Such is the plight and such is the privilege of the children of Israel. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay Jewish. Have a good Shabbos.